In Vladimir Putin's Russia, a dead soldier is worth more than a living one. That's not us being hyperbolic, it is just basic economics. A 35-year-old soldier killed in Ukraine can leave his family with up to 14.5 million rubles. That's nearly $200,000, more money than most Russians from poor regions could earn in decades. This grim maths, when applied to the enormous scale of the Russia-Ukrainian war, has led economists to coin the term Deathonomics, essentially an economy where dying for the state has become the most reliable path to prosperity for families. Russian state television has even celebrated grieving parents using their son's death benefit to buy the white Lada that it always dreamed of, presenting coffin money as a heartwarming family story. Across Russia's poorest regions, military recruitment officers have become the most reliable source of economic opportunity. The human cost is staggering. But for now, the rubles are flowing, and despite a slowdown in recruitment, more continue to sign up. This is the story of how Putin turned death into both a business and military model, and what happens when a country starts trading lives for economic stability. To understand how Russia's military became its most lucrative recruiter, you need to first understand the transformation of the country's economy that began in 2022 and has accelerated since. When Russian forces first invaded Ukraine in early 2022, they were expecting to take major cities across the country, decapitate the government in Kiev, and replace it with one more aligned with Moscow's interests, all in 3 days. As you probably recall, things did not go according to plan. The military was not prepared or large enough for a long-term sustained conflict, especially given the high numbers of casualties that Russia was seeing. General mobilization, essentially forced conscription, was an option, but a dangerous one. The war was relatively unpopular from the start. Russian officials knew that dragging people into it who weren't willing to fight could be a domestic political disaster, as well as an international embarrassment. The solution? Make military service so lucrative that people would volunteer despite their reservations about the war, even if they knew it might mean their own death. Take Tuva, a mountainous republic on the Mongolian border. The average monthly salary there hovered just around 35,000 rubles. That's just over $400 American. This is not an isolated example, as much of the more rural regions of the country have very low and stagnant incomes. Across Russia's periphery, from the Caucasus republics to Siberian backwaters, monthly wages rarely exceed 50,000 rubles. Moscow is, comparatively, a city on a hill where monthly wages average 120,000 rubles, nearly 3 times the national median. It is in this environment that Russia's military enters the scene. Initial sign-up bonuses, which started at an already comparatively generous 195,000 rubles in 2022, have more than doubled to 400,000 rubles by mid-2024. And that's just from the central government. Regional governments pile on their own incentives, which in certain areas can now amount to as much as 5.2 million rubles for a soldier's first year of service. Even in poorer regions, total sign-up packages now regularly exceed 3 million rubles. But here's where it gets truly dark, and where Deathonomics really comes into play. Surviving a contract does put you on a better-than-average financial footing, but it's when you don't come home that the money really starts flowing. This is not entirely unusual. Governments the world over generally strive to look after the families of their soldiers who paid the ultimate price. But in Russia, it is both the scale of the death combined with the enormous payouts that makes it so unique. Federal death benefits start at 5 million rubles from the President's Fund. Add in another 3 million in insurance payouts. Then the regional government chips in 1 to 3 million more. Stack all this together and a dead Russian soldier generates 9 to 11 million rubles for his family. Even at the lower end, that's over $114,000. It's not a bad sum, even in the United States. In Russia, though, it's like winning the lottery and stumbling across pirate treasure all in one day. For context, the nation's median salary is 56,000 rubles per month. In certain republics, death payouts are therefore more than 2 decades of average wages, with plenty on top. The mathematics of desperation are the driving force behind this. At current capacity rates, Russia needs 30,000 new recruits monthly just to sustain its current operations. That's 1,000 to 1,500 new volunteers every single day. To their credit, this system has worked so far. Recruitment officers have seen downturns as the war drags on, but they continue to enlist a large enough number of men each month to keep the war machine going. As this conflict drags on, though, there is simply not going to be enough people willing to enlist at some point. Some estimates give Moscow another year before they can no longer sustain these losses, regardless of how much money you offer. But that's a debate for another channel. For now, we want to focus on the wildest aspect of all, how Deathonomics has managed to transform Russia's economy. Such high levels of military payouts to soldiers and families alike has no modern precedent and represents the largest wealth redistribution in post-Soviet history. Instead of achieving this through development or reform, though, this feat has been achieved through staggering numbers of deaths. Ironically, from a purely numerical side of the equation, this has succeeded where all previous attempts to stimulate the chronically impoverished peripheries outside Russia's major cities have failed. Regions that had never seen serious investment or growth suddenly found themselves awash with money from the military. The national poverty rate plummeted to 8.5%, the lowest since 1995, with analysts directly attributing the decline to military compensation lifting some of the country's poorest families above the poverty line. In the rural region of Tuva, bank deposits have jumped 151% since the start of the war. This has ironically started something of a housing boom, with construction crews struggling to keep up with demand from locals who are suddenly flushed with cash. Yet this has grim implications for the country, and not just because it's based on the death of their fellow countrymen. Families receive 11 million rubles in death benefits in regions where the average annual income is a tiny fraction of that. This is nothing short of a financial game changer for entire families. They go from multi-generational poverty to home ownership, car purchases, and education programs essentially overnight. This financial transformation hasn't been invisible. These military families have become drivers of their economy in their area, providing investments to theaters, schools, commerce centers, and beyond with their newly established wealth. In regions where poverty has been endemic for generations, this military money has created something of a new form of aristocracy. While this does have its upsides, such a massive inflow of cash also does bring challenges. Consumer spending has spiked so dramatically that some regions are experiencing inflation rates nearly 50% higher than the national average. Many traditional industries are experiencing a labor shortage as the military's goal of being the most lucrative employer has worked a bit too well. The military's positions pay significantly better than many industries for soldiers who are alive, creating a powerful incentive for local men to enlist. To the point of the labor shortage, why would someone want to toil away in a textile factory for 30,000 rubles a month when the army pays 5 to 6 times that? And this isn't theoretical. Entire sectors of the economy have been gutted. Mines operate short-staffed because so many of their workers took the significant pay boost of combat wages. Local small businesses are particularly hard hit, incapable of even coming close to military wages. The risk of not coming home is very much real, but the death benefit should be seen less as a pull incentive that has families enlisting their sons for a payday, and more as both a reassurance for the soldiers that should they not come home, their families will be taken care of, as well as a pacifying effect on the local population, who may otherwise be more vocal about their opposition to the war. This economic transformation didn't emerge overnight, but rather as a steady evolution from ongoing surprises out of the war in Ukraine that at times bordered on political crises. In September 2022, before such generous pay and bonuses were implemented, the Russian military was running short on men. The war did not appear any closer to coming to an end, and they were losing far more soldiers each day than they'd ever planned for. The stalemate they found themselves in was hardly inspiring droves of new recruits, and something had to be done. On September the 21st, 2022, President Putin signed a decree ordering the first call-up in the country since 1941. This would be a partial mobilization limited to 300,000 Russian reservists, largely those who had already been trained and served in the armed forces but were no longer on active duty. These were soldiers who had largely returned to their civilian lives, yet remained on a reserve list in case of times of national emergency. This, Putin declared, was such a time. Whether or not it was a true emergency, the reaction wasn't exactly positive. While many of the reservists obeyed the summons, the rest of the country looked on with fear as they suspected a broader conscription could be around the corner. Protests broke out throughout the country, and so many military-aged men began to flee that it quickly turned into an international embarrassment for the Kremlin. The war was going far worse than anyone thought it would, and their own people were attempting to escape into neighboring states from Georgia to Kazakhstan. Reports from Russian agencies say roughly 260,000 men left Russia within the first 5 days alone, while independent agencies put the number as high as 300,000 or even 400,000 by early October. Russians were clearly more than just concerned about the direction that the war was headed, with some 70% saying they felt fear or alarm about the draft. Whether or not they had actually laid plans for this is something we may not know for years to come, but the panic throughout the country was heard in Moscow. They knew they had to adapt and find ways to get their enlistment numbers without filling the streets with protesters. To his credit, Putin's answer was effective, yet brutal. The Kremlin would make the military too lucrative to refuse. Rather than force unwilling and disinterested civilians who have not historically made very good soldiers into service, they started increasing military pay considerably, offered sign-up bonuses, and now the infamous death benefit pay. More cynically, they targeted this recruitment strategy more heavily in the poorer areas of the country, where the pool would be stronger. Create a self-selection mechanism where poverty drives enlistment, allowing the state to claim them as volunteers while knowing full well that their situation didn't exactly leave them a choice. This strategy has succeeded beyond its original expectations, but this success reveals the cruelty with which it was constructed in the first place. By recruiting heavily from regions that Moscow doesn't much care for, partially the ethnic minority republics, Putin has managed to sustain massive military operations for 3 years without triggering regime-threatening unrest. The targeting shows surgical precision in its inequality. Republics and regions like Dagestan and Tuva often meet or exceed their recruitment goals, and Chechnya can even boast that it hit 254% of its target. Yet inequality follows these volunteers onto the battlefield. Men enlisted from Buryatia, for example, are 75 more times likely to die in Ukraine than a fellow soldier who enlisted from Moscow. This points to another aspect of the war. Those who are enlisted from the poorer regions are sent to the far more deadly front conditions, while those from Moscow are kept in comparatively safer locations. Yet despite this lopsided recruitment rate and burden, the Kremlin has been remarkably and devastatingly effective at managing public opinion through wealth creation. Geographic insulation helps. The Moscow middle class has remained largely unaffected by the first-hand impacts of the war, and the city is not a heavy center for recruitment. Outside its largest cities, the Kremlin has created a compensation package so generous that it pacifies what plausibly could be more widespread outrage at the number of Russian soldiers coming home in caskets. While the loss of their children is no less devastating, families are inherently less likely to protest a government which has financially revolutionized their life. Putin has achieved something remarkable, lifting entire regions out of poverty through military compensation. But this success reveals the system's central limit. The same economic incentives that transform these communities also make them dependent on continued conflict. As the pool of prospective recruits steadily shrinks and economic pressures mount, this war machine lurches closer to a day of reckoning. Three years into what was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation, the bills are starting to come due in ways the Kremlin could never have anticipated. This financial burden has reached genuinely staggering proportions that dwarf anything seen in the country since the Soviet collapse. The numbers tell a story not of an economy in a traditional collapse, but more caught in a bizarre form of cannibalizing itself. Defense spending has exploded to 6.2% of GDP, the highest since the days of the Cold War, when it was facing off against countries a lot larger than Ukraine and nearly triple the average in NATO. Military compensation alone eats up roughly $36 billion annually. The federal budget now dedicates 41% of spending to the military, more than education, more than healthcare, more than social services, combined. This wartime spending surge has starved civilian sectors of investment. Infrastructure projects have been shelved and civilian manufacturing has declined by 15%, all while military production runs at full capacity. Russia is essentially eating its own economic future to feed the war machine. The woman tasked with the deeply unenviable job of managing this economy is Elvira Nabiullina, Russia's central bank governor. Given this monumental challenge, she has somewhat ironically earned herself the nickname of being Russia's Iron Lady, an analogy to Margaret Thatcher, who was gifted that title by the Soviet Union for her resolute and uncompromising stances. When Nabiullina says to you that she will tell you the truth and it will be unpleasant, she is believed. A rare trait for someone in public office in Russia. Before the war broke out, she had initially sought to resign from her position at the central bank, given her opposition to the operation and understanding of what the consequences would be, only to be told to stay by Putin himself. In a leaked video, she described the economic situation as extreme and said plainly, "All of us would have wanted for this not to happen." Despite her best efforts, including an unprecedented overnight rate hike from 9.5% to 20% immediately after the invasion to stave off a total collapse of the ruble, which was at least partially successful, the structural problems run deeper than the central bank can fix. Oil and gas revenues, which have long been the lifeblood of Russia's economy, are projected to decline from 11.5 trillion rubles in 2024 to 9.77 trillion by 2027. The reasons vary, but almost all circle back to the war. Russia had long sought to integrate its energy supply into Europe and achieved success through the construction of numerous pipelines carrying natural gas to the heart of the continent. The controversial Nord Stream 2 project, which was completed but not activated, was first cancelled and later blown up. There is literally nothing left to sanction, even if the West wanted to. What remains are increasingly unfavorable deals with China and India, where Russia must sell its energy at steep discounts due to the international pariah state status that they've awarded themselves. At the same time that Russia is facing a cash crunch from economic isolation, the more obvious sustainability crisis is beginning to raise its head. The recruitment numbers they have been able to keep up these last 3 years are not something that can be maintained permanently. Third quarter 2024 saw recruitment fall somewhere between 40 and 80,000, which is far below the 90,000 needed to maintain operations. The volunteer pool in the heavily targeted regions is approaching exhaustion, meaning the Kremlin will have to start facing tough decisions as to whether it can really bring the war home by conscripting men out of their cities. Demographic trends only compound the population crisis, both for this war and for Russia going forward. Each death removes not just one soldier, but potentially several others. People are less likely to voluntarily enlist to fight a war they don't believe in after watching a brother of theirs die, especially now that the family is flush with cash. Russia's military, throughout this entire campaign, has underperformed, especially given the decade-long campaign of modernization that Putin convinced the world had undertaken. This is unlikely to improve anytime soon, and could, if anything, get worse. The initial recruits to the war were likely there through a combination of patriotism as well as their own economic interest. But think about it. Who would have sat out the war for the last 3 years and decided only today in 2025 that this is the cause worth risking your life for? The answer is economic recruits who care little about the outcome of this war and who increasingly come from troubled backgrounds. Criminals offered pardons for their service have become commonplace. Then there's the question of what to do with these soldiers after the war's over. Economist Andrei Yakovlev captured the dilemma perfectly. It'd be cheaper to keep all the soldiers on the front line. His gallows humor points to a genuine problem. Demobilized soldiers will expect to maintain their 200,000 ruble salaries. Defense workers will resist returning to civilian wages. Regions dependent on military money face economic collapse without it. Russia has created a class of soldiers who are ill-equipped to transition back to civilian life. Millions of people now depend on the conflict for their livelihoods. Entire regions have restructured their economies around military compensation. Ending the war doesn't mean peace. It means economic catastrophe for precisely those areas that have sacrificed the most. Overall, the sustainability timeline grows shorter with every passing day. Financial analysts suggest Russia can maintain current spending levels for perhaps 12 to 18 months without major new resources or dramatic cuts elsewhere. The war economy depends on ever-increasing state spending while neglecting civilian sectors, but continued military spending requires economic growth that itself depends on military expenditure. Putin has created a war economy that requires perpetual conflict to survive, but lacks the resources to fight it indefinitely. Behind these fiscal projections, though, lie the human stories of those caught in this strange system. While discussing issues of this magnitude, it can be easy to lose ourselves in statistics. But behind these statistics are real people, and this crisis can best be understood through their stories. The case of Staff Sergeant Alexei Malov in particular stands out. Malov had been a tank commander who was killed on the third day of war. Russian state television was eager to depict Malov as a patriot dying for his country. We do not doubt this, but reference the case because of how state television portrayed him. Rather than focusing on the life of Alexei, they brought in his parents to explain how they had used his death benefit to purchase a brand new Lada. "In memory of our son, we bought a nice new car," his father told the camera. The noter explains the vehicle, quote, was bought with what people call coffin money, noting that, quote, his father says that Alexei dreamt of having a white car just like this one. Its first trip is to the cemetery. The 698,000 ruble car represented roughly 2 years of average wages in the region. State television presented this as heartwarming, a family fulfilling their dead son's dreams. And in all fairness, we have no reason to doubt that the car was actually the dream vehicle of Alexei. But the presentation of it was the start of something remarkable, where the Russian government was floating the inherent upside of losing your child in war. As compensation payments expanded, so did opportunities for exploitation. Russian media and officials now document a growing phenomenon they call black widows, women who will marry soldiers specifically to collect their death benefits. The financial incentives are substantial. As we mentioned earlier, death benefits total 9 to 11 million rubles, while average salaries in peripheral regions hover around 400,000 rubles annually. These sums represent 20-plus years of normal wages, spawning an underground economy. This is a phenomenon that's been increasingly noticed in the press. Blogger Anastasia Kashivarova claims that gangs of honey traps were captured in Luhansk, operating in occupied territories where they seduce soldiers for benefits. She wrote, "They can pull off that scam repeatedly." At the Center for Support of Combatants and Their Families, staffers report knowing, quote, women who've already been married 3 times and all 3 husbands served in the special military operation. While some scam the system, families attempting to collect their legitimate benefits after the death of a family member in the armed forces have gotten caught up in bureaucracy. Initially, these were more one-off cases that could be forgiven as mismanagement, but now it appears that Moscow is attempting to limit the amount of claims being filed for these generous death benefits. Investigative reports suggest that as the death toll mounts and costs spiral, the Defense Ministry has quietly instructed regional officers to scrutinize claims more aggressively, creating bureaucratic barriers to legitimate compensation. More recently, the Russian military has systematically denied compensation by manipulating death classifications, listing killed soldiers as missing rather than dead to avoid payments. One such case is that of the Ponomaryovs. Despite being told their son Artyom was killed in Bakhmut, he remains officially listed as missing, meaning no body to bury and no compensation to claim. To quote his mother, Nadezhda, "I'm not doing what I'm doing because of money. The most important thing for me now is to find Artyom and know that he isn't rotting somewhere." The bureaucratic cruelty adds insult to mortal injury. Families who've already paid the ultimate price must now fight their own government for the compensation that was supposed to justify their sacrifice. Vladimir Putin has achieved something both remarkable and terrible. He has succeeded at lifting many in poorer regions of his country out of poverty, but for all the wrong reasons. In this system, every unemployed young man becomes potential military capital. Every indebted family becomes a recruitment opportunity. Every regional economic crisis becomes a chance to fill the ranks. Putin hasn't addressed inequality. He's turned inequality into a resource. We can see everywhere the story of this distorted reality. Regions that have never seen serious federal investment suddenly found themselves awash in military money. What 30 years of development programs failed to achieve, war payments accomplished in months. The largest wealth redistribution in post-Soviet history, achieved not through development or reform, but through death. For 3 years, the system has successfully kept the country's war machine running, and by running we mean turning out a seemingly endless supply of Russians to fight and die for Putin's war. But this system can't survive forever, and Russia has exhausted the most willing recruitment pools while creating economic dependencies that make peace politically dangerous. The ultimate tragedy isn't just the empty cause this war has been fought on, it's that for too many Russians, the devil's bargain makes perfect sense. In a society with large numbers of impoverished people, the state has finally offered them a leg up. They just might have to pay the ultimate price to get it. In a society that offers its poorest citizens nothing but neglect, the state's offer to purchase their lives at least acknowledges their existence. The price might be death, but at least there's a price. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. It isn't. The question is what happens to a society when the bills finally come due, when the coffins stop arriving, and with them the checks, when the war economy that promised prosperity delivers only the reckoning that follows. Putin has proven you can indeed put a price on human life. The real cost is what it does to a civilization that learns to accept the transaction. Thank you for watching.